This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, I will be talking about the subject of alternate history. I will be talking with an author who's written many books on it, Terry Bisson, as well as Steven Silver, who is involved in starting an awards for this subgenre. And the discussion will begin in a moment. As I mentioned, this show will talk about alternate history, and it's a subgenre of fiction that often deals with science fiction, but it doesn't have to necessarily be science fiction. As I mentioned, the two men you see on your screen, Terry Bisson and Steven Silver, have participated in this genre for quite a bit, as I like to do in all my interviews. I give each of the participants a few minutes to introduce themselves and tell what their relation is to the topic at hand. So let me start with the man on the left, Steven Silver. Steven, what is your relationship to alternate history? I mentioned that you had started or participated in awards kind of program. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and how the awards got started.
Thanks, Dan. I have a master's degree in medieval history, and I've also been interested in science fiction for several years. And back in about 1995, I got the idea that alternate history, which was having something of a renaissance at the time, could use a little bit of a boost and recognition. So I contacted a couple of other people, Evelyn Leeper and Robert Schmunk, and discussed the possibility of creating the Sidewise Award for Alternate History. We've now been giving it out for 21 years, and we'd like to think that it recognizes the best alternate history that's been published in the previous year. The award is given out every year at Worldcon, which this year will be in Kansas City, Mid-Americon 2, this August. In addition, the first story that I published back in 2008 was an alternate history that took a look at what would have happened if the Middle Ages had happened a little bit differently.
Now, obviously, alternate history is fiction. The most popular sort of memes would be, what if the South had won the Civil War? What if the Nazis had won World War II? What if the Roman Empire had not fallen? Those seem to be sort of like the big three. But just so people know, it's not necessarily has to be science fiction, does it? I mean, if we were talking about what if Napoleon had conquered Russia and set the novel in 1918, certainly we wouldn't have had the Russian Civil War, but it wouldn't necessarily be science fiction. Is that correct?
Yeah, I came to it through science fiction, but over the years I've really decided that alternate history is not, in fact, science fiction. It does, however, use the same elements that science fiction does, which is the question of what if. In one case, it's what if we were able to travel faster than the speed of light? What if aliens came to Earth? That kind of thing. In this case, it's just what if history had gone differently? And we're exploring those changes the same way you would with science fiction, which is why it tends to be lumped together with science fiction.
Yeah, and in the show, we'll explore the differences between what I would consider science fiction aspects of alternate history, and then more what we would call, I guess, the what-if scenarios that you bring up. What if the Germans hadn't invaded Russia? What if, the Battle of Bull Run had gone differently, that kind of thing. The man on the right is Terry Bisson. He, however, is someone who, as far as I know, name-wise, is associated mostly with science fiction and science fiction having to do with this very subgenre. So, Terry, for those people who may not have ever heard of you or read one of your books, if you could give us a little bit of background about yourself and what draws you to both alternate history and the science fiction end of that subgenre.
Well, I'm primarily a science fiction writer, mostly short stories, although I've written several novels, and my second, I believe, no, it was my third novel, was in fact an alternate history novel. And then my most recent novel, which is called Any Day Now, is an alternate history. Although I'm not that deep in the field, and I don't really know the field as well as Steven does. What can I say? You were right to point out that it's not exactly science fiction, although it's the commercial field, or the most active field, is definitely marketed as science fiction, and the writers like Harry Turtledove and other people that have really developed it are considered and are science fiction writers. It also exists in the field of history itself. I think, Stephen, don't they call it contrafactual or something like that? I believe there are magazines that actually publish sort of scenarios, contrafactual scenarios, and usually they're not set up like narrative, like science fiction is a literary field, and they're not literary as much, but they're like scenarios for what would have happened. And there's another name for it called Uchronia. And what does that exactly cover? Do you know, Stephen?
Uchronia is just a French term meaning history that didn't happen, or the timeline that didn't happen. So it essentially covers the same thing that alternate history, along with the counterfactuals that you find in historical research.
Yeah, okay. Well, you know what drew me, since you asked, what first drew me into alternate history, I had read a couple in science fiction, and they'd interested me. But what drew me into it actually was politics. When I wrote my first alternate history novel, which is called Fire on the Mountain, I was part of the New Left in New York City, and we were doing a lot of anti-Klan and anti-racist work, and this was back in the late 70s. And we had a group called the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, and I began to read and study a little bit about John Brown, and I worked on the newspaper. We did a newspaper regarding struggles against white supremacist groups and stuff. And the more I read about John Brown, the historical figure, the more I grew to love the man and be interested in the period just right before the Civil War and what he had done. What he did was he was an abolitionist who made a raid on Harper's Ferry. And now most people know this, but just to let you know, which was the first raid of abolitionists into the South trying to free the slaves. And it was a failure. And Brown and his men were captured and it didn't work. And but it did succeed in terrorizing the South and in sort of invigorating the abolitionist movement. And he was a big national hero to some people and a villain to others. And anyway, I ended up writing a novel. I wanted to write a novel about what would have happened if John Brown's raid had succeeded, and how would the Civil War have started differently and turned out differently. And so what impelled me into writing alternate history was not an interest in the field as a whole, but there was a story I wanted to tell, and alternate history was the way to do it. So that's what drew me into it.
So basically, your book was predicated on one of Stephen's what ifs. What if John Brown had succeeded? Was that the basic linchpin that gave you the idea? And when you're writing it, do you write down the actual history of, say, what happened, and then just project outwards farther and farther from time as to how things would have deviated?
Yeah, but you don't have to write it out. But anytime you're writing I'm sure this is true of other people too. The history's in your head, and you kind of know it, so you don't have to make one file card for the real history and one for what you're doing. You just kind of, I assume you're fairly well steeped in the history and what went wrong and what went right. And but you take off from the actual event, and then there's lots of little events that go into it. I mean, Brown's raid succeeded. As an example, Brown's raid succeeded because he dithered. He stayed in town too long. He screwed up this. He screwed up that. But you could also go back and say what went wrong actually was that Harriet Tubman got sick, because his original plan was to have Harriet Tubman join in the raid, and it was supposed to take place on the 4th of July. She got sick. It got delayed until October. This and that happened. So there's once you get involved in alternate history, it's like history itself. You realize there's a whole web of events and tiny events. In a sense, my book was about what if the raid had succeeded, and that was the hinge on which it turned. But you can also say the hinge was maybe when Harriet Tubman had tea with a friend and got a cold and then got pneumonia and wasn't able to show up, or maybe the hinge was when the friend got a cold earlier. So what you're doing is inserting yourself into the web of history, and the whole thing shakes. Every event shakes the entire web.
Yeah, and I want to talk about what I would call sort of the two B's that predicate that: the butterfly effect and bottlenecks. But let me just turn back to Stephen, since he seems to have a more historical bent on this. How far back do you think the first alternate history goes? I mean, do we find that actual historians, 1,500, 2,000 years ago, were changing facts? And did this, could one consider, say, Homer's whole output, or the idea of Atlantis, as one of the earliest examples of alternate history?
No. I mean, it does and it doesn't. I mean, I wouldn't go back to Homer or Plato. The earliest known alternate history that we have is actually from Livy, the Roman historian.
Okay.
In one of his books on history, Livy postulates that Alexander would have turned his attention west instead of east, and attacked Italy and the nascent Roman kingdom. Livy, of course, being a booster of Rome, feels that Alexander would have been defeated by the Romans, who then would have gone on to conquer the world 200 years earlier.
Mm-hmm.
That's the earliest known alternate history that we have. The earliest modern alternate history was actually a French book about Napoleon that came out in the 1800s. People played around with alternate history throughout the 1800s. Then in 1907, a guy named Chamberlain published a book called The Ifs of History, which is more of the counterfactual type of thing that Terry was talking about earlier, where he looked at, he put out thought experiments about what if this had happened differently, what if that had happened differently. That was followed up in 1932 by a book by J.C. Squires as the editor, called If It Had Happened Otherwise. Squires actually went out to several historians and said, choose something historical and change it around, see what happens. The most famous piece in that book is by Winston Churchill, called If Lee Had Not Won the Civil War, which is set in a world where Lee had won the Civil War, looking at what would have happened if the North had won the Civil War. So it gets a little bit complex and meta in that respect. The interesting thing about that book is most of the points of departure that are used by the different historians are things that you or I wouldn't even think of. They're extremely minor from our viewpoint today. They're not the things that everybody thinks of in terms of history. You had Churchill talking about the Civil War, but you also had Hilaire Belloc's piece called If Drouet's Card Had Stuck, which was about the French Revolution.
Yeah.
That was followed up a year later in 1933 by a short story by a guy named Matt Shackner called Ancestral Voices, which some people consider to be the first real alternate history within the science fiction genre. And then a year later was Murray Leinster's Sidewise in Time, from which the Sidewise Award takes its name. Sidewise in Time, it's an alternate history, but it's also not an alternate history. The idea is that there's this weird time storm that brings pieces of various worlds together in our own world, centered around the area of Virginia. And as a college professor moves across Virginia, he passes from his own timeline to a world where the South won the Civil War, to a world where the Vikings have settled in North America and still has a very Norse culture, and so on. So you get little hints of what the alternate histories would have been, although it's not the main point of what the story is.
Yeah, from what you're saying, Stephen, it sounds like, because you mentioned Winston Churchill and a few other names that one doesn't associate necessarily with pop culture. Is it fair to say that some of the earlier attempts at looking at alternate history were more based in philosophy and sociology rather than fiction?
Yeah, for the most part, it was definitely an idea of, everybody plays the what if game. I mean, on the most personal level, it's what if I hadn't asked that woman out,
Yeah.
who became my wife? What if I had accepted this job? What if I had turned left and gotten T-boned by that truck coming up? We all do that. And that's pretty much what was going on all those years. That just some people would write down their what ifs when they were thinking about history. And philosophically, it helps you try to understand what's going on in history, why things happen the way they do. Now, we've mentioned counterfactual history. When I was working on my master's degree, every time somebody would bring up a counterfactual point, my advisor would say, stop, we're not doing that right now. You have to get the basics down before you can start playing around with it. So it is something that everybody does. You just want to be careful about how you're doing it if you're trying to look at the actual history of something.
Now, I'd like to say, if I could put in here just a defense of science fiction writers, I think when you say it wasn't pop culture but philosophy, just about most of the science fiction writers or any kind of narrative writers that have taken it on have had a philosophical or a political bone they wanted to chew. So nobody takes it on just to make a story. Generally, people take it on because, I remember the first book I read was called Pavan by Keith Roberts, wasn't it?
Yes.
A British writer, about what if the storm that scattered the Spanish Armada had not happened. And so he writes this whole book about basically a pre-steampunk medieval England that never went through the Industrial Revolution. And anyway, there's a lot of philosophy, there's a lot of historical speculation and politics embedded in that. So it's not just a way of telling a story. And like I was talking about the book that I wrote, the story is the way of making the point.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. The other thing I want to point out is one of the things that science fiction writers have tended to bring to this that a lot of the earlier authors didn't was the idea of narrative. A lot of the essays in If It Had Happened Otherwise and the Ifs of History tended to just kind of put it out there and kind of speculate on what would have happened, but they didn't have characters, they didn't have plot, they didn't have a middle, beginning, and end. It was just a, hey, what if this had happened kind of thing. Science fiction writers brought the idea of a whole narrative to it so that you could read it through and you could get your philosophy, your politics, whatever it is, with a little teaspoon of sugar.
Yeah, Terry had mentioned that one of his first books had, hinged on perhaps someone getting a cold or whatnot, and this led to his counterfactual history. Let's talk about the whole genre. Is there sort of a divide from, say, the things where we get a small event that changes history versus the large events, such as you had mentioned, had Alexander gone west, had Hitler not initiated Barbarossa at a certain time, had Lee done this or that? Is there a divide between the big events that change history in this genre and the small events, or is the divide more or less along the line as things that are totally changed historically versus history as we know it with one or two minor exceptions?
The most interesting ones have a big impact, whether the change was big or small. Harry Turtledove has written a whole series where the basic idea of the series was during the Civil War, a courier dropped some cigars, okay? And wrapped around the cigars were Lee's Special Orders 191. And those have...
Which is a true story, right?
Which is a true story.
Yeah.
And in reality, the cigars were found by a northerner who understood what he had found, and they were able to act on that. So in Turtledove's version, the cigars were not found by somebody who understood what he had found. The South was able to put the plan into effect and secede from the Union. So that's a really small thing that has major impacts. That's not really, Alexander going west necessarily, but it is something that has a major ripple effect. On the other hand, you also have what I consider personal alternate histories, which can be great literature. Frankly, I saw one of them on stage about a week ago. but it doesn't have the same impact because in a lot of those cases, the story is so personal in nature that although it's alternate history for an individual, it doesn't have the wide-ranging impacts. A couple examples from film. The most famous would be It's a Wonderful Life with Jimmy Stewart. It's an alternate history. The way they set it up there, of course, is we see what Jimmy Stewart's life is like. We see why he's depressed, and then he makes his wish. I wish I had never been born. That sparks off the alternate history. Clarence comes down, removes Jimmy Stewart from history, and now we see what happens if Jimmy Stewart hadn't been there. His brother dies when he falls into the pond, which means that the people on the ship that he saves during the war don't get saved. Potter takes over the town, and it becomes a horrendous dystopia. And so that's an alternate history that is very personal. It's not a real alternate history. None of the events in it actually happened. But it's set up as an alternate history. More recently, we had the movie Sliding Doors with Gwyneth Paltrow, which shows the alternate history in two timelines. You see the split, and then it follows both of them scene by scene until it comes back together at the very end.
Yeah, and that Paltrow movie was actually based on a very good Polish movie whose name I forget. But let me ask you, Terry, you'd mentioned that you'd done several books. Are most of your alternate history books based on sort of this butterfly effect, something small that changes, or does something change and then in the year 2016 in your alternate history where going to the stars already? What kind of alternate histories do you base most of your works on?
Well, see, I think your distinction between big events and small it doesn't really work in narrative because big events are caused by small events, and so it's really a question of how the story is told, where you start with it. I think one of science fiction's most iconic alternate histories is The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick, where the Nazis and the Japanese win the war and they split the U.S. I don't think Dick went into a lot of detail about how that happened. That was just the big event, and then he goes beyond that. But I think most writers, like Harry Turtledove, if they want to, they'll take their big event, but they'll also embed it in the narrative in a way, which means they have to explain how it happened. So you've got the wrong person finding the cigars, with the message. In my own work, like I say, I've only done two alternate histories, and the one was about the Civil War, and the main idea of it was that John Brown's raid succeeded. So I went into, and I didn't like I said, there were some details about who was supposed to join him and when the raid was supposed to happen and everything. I didn't spend a lot of time on that. I spent most of my time on what happened after the raid. So I would say that was mainly about the big event. The most recent, I did an alternate history back about 2 or 3 years ago, much more current, also from a leftist point of view, because that's basically who I am. And it was an alternate history basically of 68 and 69, the time, the height of the 60s, where you had the rebellions in France and here in the U.S., the anti-war movement,
the Prague Spring.
Kind of stuff. And you had, and in that one, the story, basically I had history changing through a number of different events. One, the Soviet Union didn't collapse. There was actually a coup in the Soviet Union which sort of kept it going. And I don't know, and then just for fun, I embedded in a few other little things like James Dean not dying and Arthur C. Clarke dying in 1956, and but it was kind of just for fun. And so what am I trying to say? I think you can go either way. You're either interested in how the event came to pass, and then you sort of extrapolate after that, or you can be primarily interested in what happened after the event and not too much in it. So So I would say I've played around with both of them, but I think most writers do. That's kind of how you do it.
Well, let me end this first segment with two questions here, and they're pretty independent. But let me go back to Stephen and ask, since history, we're talking alternate history, and there's certainly political elements, whether we're talking about the fall of Rome or the fall of the USSR or whatnot. Have there been works that were written specifically as agitprop? And I bring this up because I recently rewatched the World War II documentary, The World at War, and in one of the supplemental discs, there's some footage from a famous Nazi film that tried to depict the Jews as rodents and carriers of vermin. And this was sent out that if we don't stop the Jews, if we don't have the final solution, this is what's going to happen to Europe. Have there been works, rather in whatever media, written or filmic, that one or two that stand out to you as particularly works of agitprop, and did they succeed in any particular way in their political ambitions?
I'm sure that there have been. I can't think of any offhand.
Okay.
I mean, one of the problems is when you get too much into the agitprop area of anything, you tend to lose. It tends to become much more polemic than narrative, and it can be very effective. But from a do I want to read this or do I want to watch this point of view, it tends to lose a lot. Offhand, I can't think of any, but I'm sure that they exist.
Okay.
Well,
go ahead.
Can I put in on that?
Sure, Harry.
There's one. The one I would call most agitprop, I think the way Stephen is using it, when you say agitprop, you mean it wasn't a very good book. It was it made a point, but rather crudely.
It was polemical rather than artistic. Its main purpose.
Yeah. I mean, I would the first novel I wrote, the Fire on the Mountain, the one about John Brown, I would regard as agitprop because I was totally making a number of political points, but I think I tried to make it work as a novel also. But there's one that's hardly ever mentioned that I think was kind of tossed off, and I would call it agitprop because it was by a very good writer who didn't seem to spend a lot of time and energy on it, but just had this explosive idea and sort of banged it out, was Martin Cruz Smith, who wrote a book called The Indians Won. Have you ever heard of that one, Stephen?
Yes, I have.
And I would call it a particularly good book, but I love the idea because I always sympathize with the Indians and their fight against genocide. And I think the fundamental idea of that was after the Civil War, the Brits through Canada smuggled modern arms and stuff into the Plains Indians, and so the result being that the U.S. was not able to build the railroads and unify the continent in the way that they did, and the Indians won. And he doesn't really do that. I would love to hear your opinion on it. I feel like he didn't develop it much, but it was such a good idea. It was fun.
Yeah, no, I agree. It is a fun book, or the idea behind it is fun. It could have been a better book. I think the way I was taking Dan's question was an alternate history that was written to impact real time. So, for instance, if during the Vietnam War somebody had written an alternate history that kind of rewrote how we got into the Vietnam War in order to build support for the war while it was actually happening. That's what I was trying to come up with when I was answering Dan.
Yeah, I was looking for more like who's the famous Nazi woman who did the films that were the propagandists that Riefenstahl. Was there an equivalent in the alt history subgenre of a Riefenstahl? But let me end this first segment going back though, because I mentioned that probably the three, from what I've looked online and also just casually over the years having observed, the three biggest what-if scenarios seem to always be the fall of Rome, the U.S. Civil War, and World War II outcomes. Do you think that those things have run their course? And if so, what do you see as more potential feeding ground for future alt history works, whether in film or TV or fiction?
Well, yes, reading for the Sidewise Awards, I comment to the other judges, if I never see another World War II or never see another Civil War story again, I would be perfectly happy. I have read so many alternate Civil War stories and so many alternate World War II stories, and every year, every couple of years, somebody comes up with something that's new, that's different, that's fantastic, and you read it and you go, wow, that's fantastic. A lot of times these wind up winning the award because even if the trope itself is stale, people come up with new ways of doing it that are interesting. So I don't think they're going away anytime soon. In France, Napoleon is a big one for points of divergence.
Yeah.
He's their version of the Civil War, essentially. Frankly, I prefer when people do alternate history that gets away from war entirely. A social or an institutional alternate history, where you don't have to worry about battles and things like that. Unfortunately, most Americans do not have a firm grasp of history outside of the Civil War and World War II.
Yeah.
And so those are the easiest entry points for people. The author doesn't have to explain the real history as much as if they choose something. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution, if they make that the point of change, there's going to have to be a lot more explaining than if the change is the Japanese not attacking Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
They're just different touchstones in our society.
Yeah. Well, let's say in this. Go ahead, Terry.
Well, I was just going to say, you're talking about Napoleon. In a sense, he wrote his own alternate history, where he escaped from Elba and had a second. He decided to rewrite his career,
Yes.
the history of Napoleon, and it lasted a year and a half or so, and it almost worked. In terms of course, it's hard to write an alternate history about the future. You're asking what. I think people could write alternate histories about if civilization had actually survived, what would happen to the world? What if people had been able to, were not able to achieve interstellar travel, which is what Stan Robinson's latest novel is about. And I don't know what. I think it's hard to imagine what alternate history is going to be like in the future because we don't really know what the future is going to be like. So anyway, I'm rambling. But I think one other thing I'd like to say, the biggest and most ambitious alternate history, and one of the most successful, was Years of Rice and Salt by Kim Stanley Robinson, which takes a huge idea, which fundamentally is what if the modern world and technology and stuff had not been developed by Europe, and Europe had not been a player at all? What if you had the last 500 years without Europe? And he develops that in a brilliant way, where you still have Darwin and Edison and Newton, but they have different names and they came from different places. And the fundamental idea is that the world we live in, the technological world, would have developed, but along somewhat different lines and from different people and stuff like this. And I think it was quite well done. And the huge event was basically the Black Plague.
Yeah, that sounds sort of like a much more subtle version of a polemical novel, where you're not actually, saying, well, what if Hitler had done this, or what if Napoleon had done that, but going much more subtly into the roots of, the great men of history versus the tides of history kind of view of life.
Yeah. Right. And the idea of the great man versus the tides of history is one of the primary things that alternate history does tend to look at.
Well, let's explore that in our next segment, along with some other things. And let's end this segment right here, and we'll be back in a moment. Well, we left off in the last segment with talking about the great men view of history versus sort of the sort of sweeping tides of history, where things will basically work out in a similar, if not, exact way as they are today. I know back around the turn of the century, this last century, 21st, there were a lot of lists on the burgeoning internet about, the 100 most influential this in sciences, leader, whatnot. And I remember seeing many shows, and one of the things that I recall thinking of, because I saw a show that had people like Daniel Dennett and Steven Pinker and some big names talking about the most important people of the last 1,000 years. And I was kind of surprised to see that Genghis Khan wasn't listed on it, because I always thought to myself, if you had to remove one person from history of the last 1,000 years and see how much the world would change, he had to be it, because there's no Genghis Khan, there's no Mongol Empire, because for 6,000 years they just roamed the steppes up there doing basically nothing. He changed the course of Chinese history. The Chinese became much more inward and fearful of outsiders. If China had not had the Mongols, they may have crossed the Pacific and helped to colonize America. If there had been no Mongol Empire, the Muslims would have probably overrun Europe, and Christianity is reduced to a Nordic cult. And so you might have had the America split between an Islamic Europe and a superpower China. And I've always found that more interesting. But do you think that the best works within the genre of alternate history tend to be those great men works? What if there wasn't so and so? Or, as you had mentioned, Stephen, the more subtler works where we get these slight changes here or there.
I think that the ones that tend to stand out for me are the ones that do tend to be more subtle.
Yeah.
Occasionally you get a great man work that really rises above, but usually it's something a lot more subtle. I mentioned that one by Harry Turtledove earlier. William Sanders has a very fun one called Journey to Fusang, which actually does play off of the Mongols, in which the Mongols sacked Europe, causing the Chinese and the Japanese to discover the New World and settle it. But really, it's when people look at the overarching effects of history rather than one particular linchpin. It could be a small event, like we said, it could be a large event, but it's usually not the removal or the addition of one particular person that makes for the best pieces.
Yeah, I think that's because writers are looking for something a little more subtle than Lee dies or Hitler dies or something, and they're looking for another hinge. It's like you say, it's more subtle. I think what you're talking about, Genghis Khan, that's really the engine of Years of Rise and Salt, the Kim Stanley Robinson novel, because the Mongol hordes are not stopped in Hungary and Bulgaria, but they there they are in Paris, and there's only like 3 survivors who are these homeless dudes sitting on the street, and they fundamentally take over Europe, but it's not Europe anymore.
Yeah.
And so you have, just what I said, you have where the Chinese discover America and so forth.
Well, let me ask, because since alternate history is itself a genre or a subgenre, I would assume that, Stephen, with your awards, you just don't have one single award for the best novel. There must be subgenres, a handful of awards for different types. What if so, what are those sort of subgenres, and what are the strands that separate each of them out from the other?
Well, actually, it's a lot more simple than that. We give out 3 awards. We give out 2 awards annually.
Okay.
One is for novel or series, and one is for short story. And then every now and then we'll give out a special achievement award to somebody for a book that came out before we started the awards or for their career. We've given those out to 3 times. L. Sprague de Camp won the first one because he really helped get the alternate history genre going within science fiction. Randall Garrett won it for his Lord Darcy series, which was a merger of alternate history and fantasy. And then a guy named Robert Sobel won it for an excellent book called For Want of a Nail. For want of it, Robert Sobel was an economic historian who taught at Hofstra, I believe. And he wrote this absolutely amazing book that was predicated on the Americans losing losing the Revolutionary War. And when you read it, it reads like a history textbook. There's no real narrative. It is a history textbook. It has a history textbook's apparatus, footnotes, endnotes, everything. And some of them are real, and some of the books that it refers to are real books, and others aren't. And when you read it, it is as if this book fell through a wormhole from an alternative 1972, whenever it was published, because it has absolutely no reference to our own world.
Who published the book?
Hold on, let me take a quick look on that.
An academic press, or was it a trade book, or what?
I think it was originally an academic press. It actually was brought back into print a few years ago. It was originally published in '73 by Macmillan.
Okay.
And then in 1997, we gave him the Sideways Award, and it was also reprinted by Greenhill Stackpole Press. And it is just the most incredible thing to read. And by the end of it, you're kind of questioning, the world that you live in. Are you in the real world? Because it is so detailed. Other people have tried it over the years, much less successfully. But this book is absolutely amazing. For Want of a Nail by Robert Sobel.
Cool. Could I say something about a book that hasn't come out yet?
Yeah, go ahead.
An alternate history called Judenstaat, Judenstaat, which means the Jewish state. And it's written by a woman named Simone Zelich, and it's going to be published by Tor, even though it's not a science fiction book. And it's a book about it's a thriller set in Israel back in the late 1950s, but Israel is in Germany. The whole alternate idea of this book is that Israel was not established in Palestine by the United Nations, by the West, but was basically established in land that Germany had to secede for the crimes of the war. And it's an absolutely fascinating and brilliant book. And all the disputes in Israel are about should they be speaking Yiddish or Saxon, and it has all the stuff with the Soviet Union, the Cold War, the Americans and stuff, but just the idea of Israel being on the land where the Jews actually mostly came from in the time of the Second World War, I thought was brilliant. This book it's very controversial, of course. And it was fished around. She couldn't find a publisher, and she actually came to me because I work with a leftist publisher out here. They didn't want it, and so I sent her to David Hartwell, and David Hartwell picked it up for Tor, and it's going to come out, I think, in June or maybe later this month, but it'll come out this year.
It's a June release.
It's a what? A June
release.
So you've heard of the book?
Yes.
That's good. What do you think? Did you read it?
I have not had a chance to read it yet. I'm expecting to get a copy of it relatively soon.
Yeah. Well, it's an amazing piece. So people are, and that's an alternate history of I thought it was a fascinating book.
Well, I had mentioned earlier two big B's that are associated with alternate history, one of them being the butterfly effect. And for those who don't know, it's basically, I think it might be an old Chinese proverb that, a butterfly flaps its wings in one province and a cyclone comes in another province. And most of the books that we've been talking about, most of the works that we've mentioned have sort of been in that sort of mindset that an event that happened, say, at a particular time is changed slightly, and therefore all of the things that sort of radiated out of that are somewhat different to one degree or another. Let me just ask whether, Terry, if you've written a book in the opposite way, or if Stephen knows about it, where we have sort of an opposite butterfly effect, meaning that the novel is set at a given time, let's say 1984, and Reagan is still president. But as we go backwards in time, we see that we got to that end point in a different manner, maybe meaning that the U.S. wasn't formed until the War of 1812 or something. Are there works that are sort of that opposite butterfly effect, where we're given a particular point in time that's exactly as we know it, but we arrive there in a different manner?
Well, that's an interesting idea. I wonder, you sort of lose the, well, it sounds like a difficult thing to do. I can't think of anybody that's done it.
No. How about you, Steve? Have you ever encountered works like that?
Not that I can think of offhand. I mean, it's kind of the idea of convergent evolution.
Yeah.
Just applied to history. It vaguely sounds familiar, but I would have to really kind of sit down and kind of chart out what there's out there to come up with something that that would apply to.
Well, you mentioned convergent evolution, and let me just ask, I know back about 20, 25 years ago, there was a proposal by some people, and I've seen, for example, books on alternate Earths. What if the dinosaurs hadn't died? What if the comet or whatever that ended the dinosaurs' reign hadn't happened, or whatnot? Are those sorts of books also considered alternate history, or are they more in the fantasy realm?
Okay, actually, I want to back up because I did just think of a couple of answers to your first question.
Okay, go ahead.
One of the reasons why I didn't think of these initially is because there's a difference between alternate history and secret history. Okay, and I think that the convergent history idea tends to fall more into the secret history category. And the difference is, in a secret history, if everything that is told in the story happened the way that it's described, it would not impact the current world in any way. Everything might have happened differently, but it kind of gets wiped out at the end. And two books that I can think of offhand that this applied to, one of them is by Catherine Kurtz. It's called Two Crowns for America, where everything that was going on during the American Revolution happens differently because of the Masons being involved. But at the very end, our world looks exactly the same. So it doesn't have an impact. So it's not really alternate history, it's secret history. The other one is a fantastic book by Jack Dan called The Memory Cathedral, in which Leonardo da Vinci actually manages to create a flying machine in the 1400s. A lot of his other experiments work out, but in the end, it's all erased, and so the world continues on the way that we always knew it. It's just that if you read this, you know what actually happened, but it doesn't impact our own history. So those are the closest things I can think of to your reverse butterfly idea.
Okay.
Well, in many ways, what you're talking about is conspiracy theory. Also, most conspiracy theories are secret history because we have the world we have, but it came about because of stuff that we didn't know was going on.
Right.
I did a book literally on the butterfly effect a few years ago, but it was sort of a comic novel where they actually went to Costa Rica and they found the butterfly, so they were able to control when the butterfly did what it was going to do, and so they could control the weather in the future. And this was all done by a wedding planner, so it didn't have to do with world history.
So
now, one book we haven't mentioned, I'd just like to say a word about, is Philip Roth's The Plot Against America, which I thought was a fine book. But Roth, this is where Lindbergh becomes president, and it was based on there was a huge right wing movement in the country and at the time, and then what was interesting to me about that was that Roth had no idea he was writing an alternative history. He thought he had made up the whole thing. He had no idea that it even existed as a way of looking at the world. And so there's a kind of requirement in alternate history that you discuss how things turned out, and he leaves that out entirely. And in a sense, he ends up with the same America. If you look at the end of that book.
Right. Yeah. You mentioned following up on the changes. Several years ago, I was writing an article for a magazine called Helix. And in it, I laid out what I considered to be the three essential things that any alternate history has to have in it. One of them is it has to have a change in the timeline is writing the book. If I were to write a story set in 2020, it does not automatically become alternate history in 2021. There has to be a change in the history that would actually have an impact that's known, so that it's not a secret history. Right. And you have to have some sort of examination of the ramifications of that change, either short-term or long-term. The short-term changes, of course, are easier because as they ripple out, the changes get bigger and bigger. And it's a little bit harder to figure out what all of them are. So.
Right.
Well, let me get back to what I was talking about. If, let's say, the dinosaurs hadn't been wiped out, or, for example, if it was discovered that ancient astronauts did help build the pyramids, are those considered alternate histories, or are those more fantastical fantasy works?
Are you saying that alien astronauts didn't help build the pyramids?
I thought that they built them so they could store their grain. It depends. And I've had this discussion with Harry Turtledove. He has a story that won the Hugo Award, where the point of departure is the Mediterranean basin never flooded, which technically it's an alternate history. The thing is, it changes this culture and the civilization so much that it's very unidentifiable from our own point of view. And from my point of view, it might technically be an alternate history, but it reads like a fantasy or an otherworld story. There's another series that's being edited right now by Bill Fawcett. Hold on a second, let me grab the title of it. It's a collection of short stories called By Tooth and Claw, being published by Baen, in which you do have dinosaurs living in our modern world kind of thing, or alien creatures living in our modern world setting. And technically, it's an alternate history. The world's history went differently. It follows up on the changes, it extrapolates. But it doesn't read like alternate history. It's so different that it really does read like a fantasy or a science fiction novel.
Yeah, and so something like The Planet of the Apes, the original book by Pierre Boulle, that would be considered fantasy then, that not alternate history.
Yeah, either fantasy or science fiction.
Well, let me...
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Terry.
Well, the point of like Planet of the Apes is not, the interest is not in the history, but in the outcome, and there's just not enough interest in the engine that makes it happen. That's how I would put it.
Well, going out.
Anyway,
there has to be a certain historical awareness to the author.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that's part of it. There does seem to be things that certain tropes in science fiction require. It's like if you're doing a time travel novel, there has to be a paradox. It will just appear in there, And I think in alternate history, there will be a certain amount of energy attached to how to the event, the hinge itself, the swinging of the door, and it's just part of it's part of what makes it a genre.
Yeah, and Stephen had mentioned about one of the, sort of the three templates or the three ideas that define alternate history. Let me ask about things we would probably call future histories, like Foundation series, or before that, was it Ola Stapleton that did Future Men? What's it called? Past and Future Men. That posits that the pivot point is somewhere in the future, and we get to a galactic empire or this or that. And clearly now, 60, 70, 80 years on, whatever it might be, we know, for example, that a lot of the things posited in the Foundation scientifically aren't going to happen. Is that considered a sort of subgenre of alternate history, or is that more in the fantasy realm as well?
I would not consider it alternate history at all. Like I said, for it to be alternate history, the point of divergence has to be before the author was writing. It has to be a matter of authorial intent.
Okay.
Otherwise, Star Trek is alternate history. It's science fiction. It's become slightly dated science fiction.
Okay.
But see, I think there is a subgenre called the future history that Asimov and them did a lot with. I think all that does is reveal that science fiction writers have, as a group, have an interest in history, because that's what they're writing. They're embedded in history. There's a basic assumption in science fiction that history is a moving thing and that you're in it, and a lot of novels and a lot of fiction are not about that at all. And all science fiction writers, in a sense, are writing about history, even though they're not alternate histories.
Right. I mean, you mentioned Asimov, and he said the Foundation series comes out of reading The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
And a lot of science fiction authors and fantasy authors read history and plunder it. They might file up the serial numbers to the extent that you can't figure out what they're stealing from, but a lot of them do.
Well, let me turn to Terry. Terry, you said that you've written a number of novels in this subgenre. You talked a little bit about your first one. Let me talk, or let me sort of give you a little bit of plug here. Tell me what is maybe your best received book or most well-known book in that subgenre, and what was its plot point, its pivot point, and do you think the thing that made it popular was a particular thing that maybe the other books didn't have? What if we're talking about the mechanics of the story?
Well, the only one that's very popular and in a small way is the one I was talking about, the John Brown book. It's of interest to radicals, of people in the Black movement, because it has to do with an independent Black nation being built in the South and stuff. The politics of it make it interesting. I've really only written two. The second one I wrote was really about the 1960s, and which I was a participant in, like the political movements and the hippie movement, the communes and stuff. And I wrote that one because people said, "Oh, you should write about your experiences in the Colorado communes or the New Left and stuff." And I said, "But everybody knows how that turned out." And then I thought, well, what if it turned out differently? Maybe I would write a novel about where the 60s actually had a different denouement, or however you say it. But unfortunately, that book didn't have much impact. So I can't talk to which one of mine is the most popular, because none of them are terribly popular. Although the John Brown book has a certain cult following among people who are interested in leftist politics and stuff. But those are the only two I've written that have to do with alternate history. Now, I wrote a book, but again, it's just a science fiction novel about what if the first trip to Mars was financed by the movie studios instead of by whoever's going to do it. But that, as Steve said, that's just straight science fiction. You're just dealing with future events. And that's what all science fiction writers do. And in a sense, all science fiction writers are historical novelists. They're just dealing with the future instead of the past, by and large. And so that's what I've got to say on that.
Well, let me ask both you and Steve. In the genre or the subgenre of alternate history, do you think that there's, or especially Steve, since you run in awards, what do you think is the field or the person or the movement that is going to have the seeds for the most interesting alternate histories that are going to be written in the next few decades? Do you think it's all of this Islamism? Do you think it's artificial intelligence, perhaps the development of that? Where do you see the seeds that in 50 or 60 years they'll be bemoaning? Oh, there have been so many novels like that, the way we do about the fall of Rome or World War II now.
Well, it's interesting. People have been writing alternate history about World War II since the war was actually going on. There is alternate history about Korea and Vietnam, but not very much of it. They just haven't grabbed people in the same way.
Yeah.
I do think that you're going to see a lot of alternate history eventually coming out of, what if the 9/11 attacks had failed, and especially because that is such a kickoff point for so much of what's going on these days. The war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, the rise of ISIS. The thing is, before you can really start to write a lot of that, you need to have some idea about how it's all going to settle out. What's going to be the new status quo? And since we don't know that, it's a little bit difficult for people to start extrapolating out. Eventually, though, I do think that these first 20 years of the 21st century are going to feed into a lot of alternate history.
Do you think that there needs to be sort of a cooling off period of half a century before effective writing of alternate histories can be done? Could it be that maybe the Vietnam War or Korea are just on the cusp of having a golden age of people that are going to mine it?
I don't think it needs to necessarily be that long. I think that you have to have a set ending to something. We mentioned Philip K. Dick's The Man in the High Castle. That was written in 1964, I think, 1963, somewhere in the early 60s, which was less than 20 years after World War II. The story was fantastic. It won a Hugo Award. It had staying power. It's been in print ever since it was first published. And, of course, it's now been turned into a successful series by Amazon. And people are tuning in. So you don't necessarily need, you do need enough time to get past it so that it's not coming across as polemical or political if you want to write a good story as opposed to a good polemic. But you do need to have a sense of this is where we are now. This is an event of the past as opposed to this is an ongoing thing that I'm writing about.
How about you, Terry? What tropes or what storylines do you think are ripe in the next few decades and may become overused?
Well, I just thought of one. I think I'm going to start an alternate history novel right now. Stephen, you and Stephen gave me the idea, which is everybody's, one of the things you're wondering about is when is an actual artificial intelligence going to be developed? They call it the singularity, something that can outthink humans. And I think you could do an interesting alternate history right now saying that it was actually developed about 30 years ago, and part of its development and part of its intelligence was that it never announces itself. It disguises itself as, say, a web of regulatory agencies or a web of corporations or some kind of thing. It never identifies itself as an individual consciousness that's going to communicate with people, because why would it? Well, so that's what I'm going to begin to work on.
Well, good. Well, give Stephen and I credit at the end of the book. Let me just end this segment, and then we'll wrap up the show with a final segment. Is there a historical figure that either of you sort of scratch your heads as to why no one has written an alternate history about this book? I mean, is there some Roman general, or is there some medieval psychic or whatnot that you say to yourself, boy, I'd really love to see what would have happened if someone had written a book about that? Or maybe Terry, other than AI, is there a figure that you would like to write about sometime in the future? Either one of you, go ahead.
Go ahead, Stephen. I'm thinking.
I think one of the things is, like I said, you need to have a certain awareness level of something or somebody before you can really write about it. However, there is one medieval figure who I think is an absolutely incredible individual. I would love to see an alternate history based on him, but he is so obscure nobody's ever heard of him. He's a papal legate from the 13th century named Nicholas de Romanus. And you're all both going, who? Nicholas de Romanus was sent by the Pope to England when King John was, when England was under interdict. And he was responsible for trying to run the country, trying to bring it back into the fold of the church. And eventually, he was the guy who negotiated the terms that established the University of Oxford. And the terms that he established under are just amazing. And you're just going, wow, I want this guy to negotiate every contract I've ever had. And he's a really interesting person, but nobody knows about him.
I know one of the things that I've always thought, I originally started writing poetry years ago, and I've often said that bottleneck figures are the most interesting figures, because if you were to remove one poet from all of history and see if poetry changed, it would be Walt Whitman, because he changed poetry from this formal metric kind of stuff that was pre him to include topics that weren't used before in ways that weren't used before. And you can see in history there are often bottleneck figures in science that they're the sort of summit of what came before them, and then everything changed because they did something. Is that the kind of figure that, say, Terry would interest you in writing about, someone who is unique in place and time and what he or she did?
Well, yeah, it would, but I think you do have a problem. As Stephen pointed out, if you're writing about changing history, it has to be the history that other people know, or you have to teach them about it. And
Yeah.
so that's a lot of baggage to carry in a novel. I think the reason people write these great man or great event histories is that they're writing. That you have to write for readers who know the territory that you're writing about. And I was fascinated by what Stephen was saying about the papal legate, but I felt I was doing a little bit of that with the John Brown book because he was seen as sort of a martyr or a madman or something, and I was trying to present him as something else. But no, I don't have I don't have some secret character or somebody that I know about that I would like to bring in as a maker of history. But I agree that's why it's not really my field in the sense that it's Stevens. Like I said, I've written two alternate histories, but it's not the primary focus of my work because I don't know that much history. I'm not a scholar in medieval history or even modern history.
Okay, well, let's end this segment here, and when we get back, we'll just wrap up the show, and I'll give both Terry and Stephen a final say. We'll do that in a moment. I've been talking on this show with Stephen Silver and Terry Bisson about the concept of alternate history, and I want to just give them a few minutes to just wrap up their final thoughts. If you've enjoyed the conversation, I'll have links to both Stephen's website and Terry's website below so you can explore further both Stephen and his awards and Terry and his writing. Terry, let me start with you and ask you for any final thoughts you have on the genre and where maybe you think it's going in the next half century or so.
Well, as I said, I'm only a journeyman in the field. I think that Stephen is actually somebody who's done a lot, not only studied it as a scholar, but helped develop it as a promoter and a publisher and a writer and somebody in the field that has helped create it as a sort of discrete subgenre in science fiction, even though it's always been here. It's like he herded all the goats into a pen, and so we can see that the similarities, that they're all goats. And I appreciate that. I think he's well known in science fiction for doing this. As far as alternate history, as I say, I have done it twice, but not primarily. I'm only a journeyman in science fiction altogether, and I've used alternate history a couple of times because there was a political idea I wanted to examine, or there was a story that I wanted to tell that carried a certain philosophical or speculative weight. But I couldn't really. I think that the field right now is much livelier than it was. I think I wrote Fire on the Mountain back in 84, 85, quite a while ago. And at that time right now I think there's a lot more interest in people developing alternate history in short stories, and you see it in movies and stuff like that. And I think that's a new development, but I'm not really part of that. I think Stephen is in a much bigger way. I think it enriches the field. It helps people think a little more about history, and but as Sturgeon said, a lot of it's just people working changes on stuff, and a lot of it's not important, but the unimportant stuff is the soil out of which the great science fiction or the great alternate history novels. Again, I would talk about Years of Rice and Salt, and the Philip K. Dick, and that has to grow out of a great interest and a commercial viability to a field, and so I thank Stephen for that, actually.
Well, let me give the final, the last word on this to Stephen, and let me just ask before I ask you for your views on the genre as a whole. Where is the awards going? Say, do you think in the next 5 or 10 years? Do you hope to expand? And what exactly are the awards? Do the people get a stipend, or do they just get an award, or do they get a contract, or what?
Yeah, it's a big stipend. It's like all these science fiction awards.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of cash and a little trophy.
Sorry, I wish I had thought that downstairs I have one of the awards. I could have held it up. No, the award, which is, like I said, is given out at the Worldcon most years, will be given out this year at Mid-Americon. Basically, it's a plaque. We give a plaque. It has the Sidewise Award logo, which is 2 intertwined clocks showing the same time, one of them with Roman numerals, one of them with Arabic numerals on them. And then around it is we list the year that the award is given in 6 different calendars. And what's fun is every now and then I'll change up which calendars are on the plaque. And every now and then somebody who won the award will actually come back to me a few years later and say, I figured out what this is, and I figured out what year this is, but what dating mechanism is this one based on? So, I try to have a little bit of fun with it. I don't see a whole lot of changes to the award coming up. Long form and short form are really the way, it's worked for us now for 20-odd years. I would like to see us give out a few more special achievement awards. To do that, I need agreement on all the judges. Right now, we have 7 judges on the panel. So that's what the Sidewise Award is. We like to think that we're recognizing the best alternate history. We try to read everything that comes out. Occasionally, we miss some things. And we have several different judges, so opinions vary, and we get into nice discussions about is this alternate history or isn't it? And, it's a good alternate history, but it's a bad novel sometimes comes up, or it's a good novel and it's bad alternate history. And you have to decide how to weigh each of those things when making the decision. So.
And how about the genre as a whole? Where do you think that it's going in the next few decades?
Well, I think that you're going to see a lot more stories based on the American Civil War, and I think that World War II is going to be a very hot area for people to write about. Eventually, every now and then you'll see something that's a little bit out there, focusing on a different point of divergence. Every few years, you're going to find a non-science fiction author discover alternate history the way Philip Roth did. Robert Harris discovered it with his book Fatherland, also, by the way, about World War II. It seems that the films have discovered it, but they've gone beyond the personal alternate history that I mentioned earlier, and now they're doing things like Man in the High Castle. I don't know how commercial it will be in film, just because you need to have a pretty good understanding of history, and that's going to always limit its appeal. Occasionally, the History Channel has run some one-off segments on alternate history, and they've been pretty good, but they haven't really had legs. There's an excellent movie out called CSA that posits a
Confederate.
The South won the Civil War, surprise, and it focuses on the African Americans who have fled up to Canada to get away from the repressive regime. So, and earlier I mentioned going to see a play or a musical last week about alternate history. Again, a personal alternate history. It's a musical called If Then, which focuses on a woman and the difference her life would have taken if she makes a couple of different choices. I'd like to end, by the way, with a quote from Will Shutterly, another author. Will noted that there are no correct alternate histories. There are only plausible alternate histories. And that's one of the things that you see. You can take the same, Terry and I can take the same point of history, leap off of it, come up with wildly divergent stories. And as long as there's plausibility in both of them and you can maintain the suspension of belief for the duration of the story, that's a workable alternate history. They're both correct because they're both plausible.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank both of you. I know I sort of gave up on the History Channel about a decade ago. I remember I was at lunch at one of my jobs at work, and I saw they did the history of concrete, and I was like, are you kidding me? I mean, with all the great historical figures you're doing the history of concrete, but now I look back and I've seen like they do these ancient alien kind of things, and that looks like the golden age for that network. But anyway, I wanted to thank both Terry and Steve for their opinions, and it was an enjoyable discussion. And people, as I said, can check out their works by looking below this video for both of their websites. So again, thanks to both of you.